The wind tore through the trees like claws raking against bark, and Elena ran faster than she had ever run in her life. Behind her, the howls of her own pack echoed through the frozen forest, calling her name, calling her back to a life she refused to return to. Snow bit into her bare feet with every step, but she did not slow down. She could not slow down, not when the alternative was being handed over like a piece of property to a pack she had never met, to an alpha she had never seen, all so her own pack leader could seal a peace deal that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with his own ambition. She had heard the announcement only hours earlier, standing at the edge of the great hall, while Alpha Victor Marsh spoke the words that shattered whatever fragile hope she had left. An Omega, he had said, looking directly at her, was of little value to the pack, except in what she could offer to secure its future. She was to be given to the Alpha of the Ashwood pack within the week, a gift wrapped in fur and bone, traded away like she had no voice of her own. Elena had spent her whole life being told she was worth less than the others. As an Omega, she stood at the very bottom of the pack hierarchy, expected to serve without complaint, to accept scraps of kindness, as though they were feasts, to disappear into corners so the stronger wolves would not have to look at her. She had grown used to being invisible. But being invisible was one thing. Being sold away like cargo was another. So she ran. The forest around her was unfamiliar, thick with old pines and jagged rocks hidden beneath fresh snow. She had left in such a hurry that she carried nothing with her. No supplies, no map. Only the clothes on her back, and the desperate hope that distance alone would be enough to save her. Her lungs burned with each breath of icy air. Her legs ached from hours of relentless motion. Still, she pushed forward, driven by a fear greater than exhaustion. Somewhere behind her, the howls faded, swallowed by the storm that had begun to build overhead. Thick clouds rolled across the darkening sky, and the wind picked up speed, throwing sheets of snow sideways, so that the world around her blurred into a wall of white. She had hoped the storm would slow down her pursuers. She had not considered that it might also be the thing that killed her. Her steps grew unsteady as the cold seeped deeper into her bones. She stumbled over a hidden root and fell hard into the snow, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. For a moment, she simply lay there, staring up at the churning sky, wondering if this was how it would end. Not captured, not traded away, just frozen, forgotten, buried beneath snow in a forest that did not belong to her. But something in her refused to give up. She thought of every night she had gone without food so someone stronger could eat first. She thought of every order barked at her, every insult thrown her way, every time she had been made to feel like less than a person. She would not let the storm finish what her pack had started. She forced herself back onto her feet, ignoring the way her whole body screamed in protest, and kept walking. Hours seemed to pass, though she could no longer tell time in any real way. Her sense of direction had long since dissolved into the whiteout around her. She walked, because stopping meant dying, and she was not ready to die, not after fighting so hard to escape. It was through sheer luck, or perhaps something greater, that she spotted a faint golden light flickering through the trees ahead. At first she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, conjuring warmth out of desperation. But as she drew closer, stumbling through drifts that reached her knees, the light solidified into something real. A small cabin stood nestled among the pines, smoke curling gently from its stone chimney, its windows glowing with the promise of warmth. Relief flooded through her so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. She had no idea who lived here, no idea if the cabin belonged to a friend or a stranger who might turn her away, or worse, but she had no other choice. The storm was growing worse by the minute, and her body could not take much more of this cold. She approached the cabin carefully, circling toward the back where a small window sat slightly open, likely left that way to let out smoke from a nearby fireplace. She hesitated only for a moment, before deciding that survival mattered more than manners. With numb fingers, she pried the window open wider and hoisted herself through, landing awkwardly on a wooden floor inside. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a physical force, and she nearly wept with gratitude. A fire crackled in the stone hearth across the room, casting flickering shadows over simple, sturdy furniture. The place looked lived in, but empty for the moment. She did not know that the cabin sat deep within the heart of the most powerful and feared wolf territory in the entire region, a place ruled not by a mere pack leader, but by an alpha king, whose authority stretched across dozens of packs. She did not know that this cabin, secluded and private, belonged to him alone, a place he retreated to when he needed distance from the endless demands of leadership. She knew only that she was warm, and for the first time in hours, safe. Elena crept toward the fireplace, drawn by its heat like a moth to flame. She settled onto the floor in front of it, wrapping her arms around herself as feeling slowly returned to her frozen limbs. The pain of thawing was almost as intense as the cold itself, needles of sensation prickling across her skin, but she welcomed it. It meant she was alive. She glanced around the cabin more carefully, now that her eyes had adjusted to the warm light. The space was simple, but well kept, clearly belonging to someone who valued solitude over luxury. A narrow bed sat against one wall, neatly made. A small table and chair occupied another corner, along with shelves holding a modest collection of books and a few carved wooden figures. There was nothing here that spoke of grand status or wealth, nothing to suggest this was the private retreat of one of the most powerful wolves in the land. If anything, the simplicity of it made her feel a strange, unexpected sense of comfort. Exhaustion pressed down on her like a physical weight. She knew she should stay alert, should be ready to explain herself or flee again if the cabin's owner returned. But her body had reached its limit. Her eyelids grew heavy, despite her best efforts to keep watch, and the crackling warmth of the fire lulled her into a state of drowsy peace she had not felt in longer than she could remember. She told herself she would rest only for a moment, just long enough to gather her strength before continuing on. But the moment stretched, and her thoughts grew hazy, and soon the exhaustion of the day's escape pulled her down into a deep and dreamless sleep, right there on the floor, in front of the fire. Her damp clothes slowly drying in the heat, her breathing evening out for the first time since she had fled her pack. Outside, the storm continued to rage, burying her tracks beneath fresh snow, erasing any trace of the path that had led her here. It was as though the forest itself had decided to protect her secret, at least for a little while. Meanwhile, far beyond the cabin's walls, deep within the borders of his territory, the wolf who ruled this land moved through the storm, with the ease of someone who had spent his entire life mastering it. Damien had been patrolling the outer edges of his territory when the scent hit him, faint at first, carried on the wind, then growing stronger as he drew closer to his private cabin. It was a scent he did not recognize, unfamiliar and out of place, tangled with fear and exhaustion. No one came near this cabin. It was known throughout his territory that this particular retreat belonged to him alone, off limits to every member of his pack, a boundary respected without question by wolves who understood exactly what it meant to defy their alpha king. And yet here was a scent trail leading directly toward it, cutting through the storm as though whoever it belonged to had been running for their life. His instincts sharpened immediately. Someone had crossed into his territory, and worse, they had come dangerously close to the one place he considered entirely his own. He quickened his pace, moving through the blinding snow with practiced precision, following the scent as it grew stronger with every step. Whoever this intruder was, they would answer for trespassing on land that did not belong to them. He reached the cabin just as the worst of the storm began to ease, the wind settling into a low, steady howl, rather than the violent gusts of before. He paused outside the door for a moment, listening. No sound came from within, except the soft crackle of the fire he had left burning before he departed earlier that day. Whoever had entered was either very skilled at staying silent, or they were no longer a threat at all. He pushed the door open slowly, every muscle in his body coiled and ready for confrontation. What he found instead stopped him completely still. There, curled up on the floor in front of his fireplace, lay a young woman he had never seen before, fast asleep, her clothes still damp from the storm, her frame far too thin, far too fragile looking for someone who had clearly trekked through such brutal conditions. She did not stir at the sound of the door. She did not so much as flinch. Whatever exhaustion had claimed her completely. Damien stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying her. This was not the intruder he had expected. There was no threat here, no danger radiating from her, only vulnerability and utter depletion. Her scent, now that he was close enough to fully take it in, told a story of its own. Fear, desperation, and beneath it all, something achingly familiar to any wolf who had ever encountered an Omega who had been pushed to their absolute limit. He should have woken her immediately. He should have demanded answers, asserted his authority, reminded her in no uncertain terms that she had trespassed on land she had no right to enter. That was what any alpha in his position would have done, and by every law that governed his kind, it was what he was expected to do. Instead, he found himself simply watching her sleep, an unfamiliar stillness settling over him as the fire crackled softly beside them both. Whatever had brought this stranger to his doorstep in the middle of a violent storm, whatever had driven her to seek shelter in the one place she should never have been able to find, it was clear she had been running from something far more dangerous than the weather. And though he did not yet understand why, some part of him, buried beneath years of duty and command, felt an unexpected pull to find out exactly what that was. For now, he let her sleep. The questions could wait until morning. But as he settled into the chair across the room, keeping careful watch over the stranger who had somehow found her way into the very heart of his private world, Damien knew with absolute certainty that nothing about tonight had been ordinary, and whatever came next would change everything. Elena woke slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings pressing in around her. For a moment she forgot where she was, her mind still fogged with sleep and the lingering exhaustion of the day before. Then her eyes focused on the stone fireplace, the simple wooden furniture, the narrow bed against the wall, and memory came rushing back all at once. She had run, she had found this cabin, she had fallen asleep on the floor without meaning to. And then she saw him. A man sat in the chair across the room, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He was unlike anyone she had ever encountered, tall and broad-shouldered, even seated, with an aura of quiet authority that seemed to fill the entire space around him. His dark eyes held hers without blinking, calm and unreadable, though something beneath that calm suggested he had been waiting a long time for her to wake. Elena scrambled backward instinctively, putting distance between herself and the stranger, her back pressing against the stone of the fireplace. Panic surged through her, sharp and immediate. She had broken into someone's home. She had trespassed on land that clearly belonged to someone powerful, someone who could easily overpower her without effort. "I did not mean to intrude," she said quickly, her voice hoarse from disuse and cold. "I was lost. There was a storm, and I saw the light, and I thought the cabin was empty. I will leave right away, I promise. I just needed shelter." The man did not respond immediately. He simply continued to study her, his gaze moving over her in a way that felt less threatening than she expected, and more searching, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle he had not anticipated encountering. "You crossed into territory that belongs to me," he said finally, his voice deep and steady, carrying an authority that left no room for argument. "This cabin is not meant for anyone but myself. No one enters here. Not my own pack, not visitors, no one." Elena's heart sank. Of all the places she could have stumbled into during the storm, she had somehow chosen the one location guarded most fiercely. She braced herself for anger, for punishment, for the kind of treatment she had grown used to receiving from those with power over her. "I am sorry," she said again, quieter this time. "I did not know. I will go now." She moved to stand, ready to face the cold once more, rather than remain somewhere she was clearly not welcome, but her legs, still weak from the previous day's ordeal, buckled beneath her. She caught herself against the stone hearth, frustration and humiliation burning through her exhaustion. The man rose from his chair in one fluid motion, crossing the room before she could protest. He did not touch her, but he positioned himself close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, an unspoken offer of support without demanding anything in return. "Sit," he said, though the command carried less harshness than she expected. "You are in no condition to walk anywhere, let alone back out into that forest." Elena hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the undeniable truth that her body simply could not sustain another trek through the wilderness. Not yet. Reluctantly, she allowed herself to sink back down, though she kept her eyes fixed warily on the stranger before her. "Who are you?" she asked, though some instinctive part of her already suspected the answer might be more significant than she wanted to admit. "Damien," he said simply. "This is my territory. All of it, as far as the mountains to the north and the river to the south. You have wandered into the heart of it." The weight of his words settled over her slowly. This was not simply someone with a modest claim to a patch of forest. This was the Alpha King himself, ruler of a territory so vast, that packs across the region paid tribute to maintain peace within his borders, and she had broken into his private cabin, uninvited, unannounced, utterly unprepared for the consequences such an act might bring. "I did not know," she whispered again, shame coloring her voice. "If I had known, I never would have come here. Please, I only needed somewhere to survive the storm. I meant no disrespect." Damien studied her for a long moment before settling back into his chair, though he kept his attention fixed on her with an intensity that made it difficult for her to look away. "Tell me your name," he said, his tone shifting slightly, curiosity now threading through the authority in his voice. "Elena," she answered softly. "And where were you running from, Elena, that you would risk your life crossing through a storm like that, with nothing to protect you from the cold?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than she expected. Elena's throat tightened as memories of the night before flooded back, the announcement in the great hall, the cold certainty that she was about to be traded away like an object, rather than treated as a person. She was not ready to share that pain with a stranger, especially not one who held so much power over her fate now that she had trespassed on his land. "It does not matter," she said quietly, looking down at her hands, rather than meeting his gaze. "I only wanted somewhere safe. I will find another place to go once the storm clears completely." I did not mean to cause trouble. Damien did not press her further, though she could sense his curiosity remained unsatisfied. Instead, he rose again, and moved toward a small kitchen area she had not noticed the night before, retrieving a simple pot and filling it with water from a container near the counter. "You need food and warmth before you attempt anything else," he said, his back to her as he worked. "Whatever brought you here, whatever you are running from, it will still be there tomorrow. For now, you will eat, and you will rest properly, not on the floor like an animal seeking scraps of heat." Elena watched him move around the small kitchen with quiet efficiency, unable to fully process the strangeness of the situation she found herself in. She had expected anger. She had expected to be punished for trespassing, perhaps even handed over to whatever authorities governed this territory, as an example of what happened to those who violated its boundaries. Instead, this powerful stranger, this alpha king who held her fate entirely in his hands, was preparing food for her, as though her presence in his home were nothing more than a minor inconvenience to be managed, rather than a crime to be punished. She did not understand it, and the confusion left her more unsettled than outright hostility would have. She had learned, through years of hard experience, that kindness from those with power rarely came without a price. She waited, tense and watchful, for the moment when his patience would run out, when the true cost of his hospitality would reveal itself. But as the fire crackled steadily beside her and the scent of warming broth began to fill the small cabin, that moment did not come. Instead, Damien simply worked in silence, occasionally glancing toward her with an expression she could not quite decipher, something between curiosity and a caution she suspected mirrored her own. Whatever this was, whatever strange turn her escape had taken her, Elena understood one thing with absolute clarity. Nothing about her situation had become simpler by stumbling into this cabin. If anything, everything had become far more complicated and far more uncertain than she had ever imagined possible. Damien set a bowl of warm broth in front of Elena and watched as she hesitated, before finally lifting the spoon with trembling hands. She ate slowly at first, as though unaccustomed to being given food without having to earn it through labor or silence, and something about that hesitation struck him more deeply than he expected. He had encountered countless wolves throughout his years as Alpha King, wolves who begged for favors, who postured for status, who tried every manner of manipulation to gain his attention. He had never encountered someone who looked at a simple bowl of broth as though it were an unearned gift. He took a seat across from her, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid crowding her already evident unease. The fire popped softly between them, casting warm light across her face, illuminating features that were sharper now that some of the desperate exhaustion had faded. She was younger than he initially guessed, though clearly not a child, with an alertness in her eyes that suggested years of learning to watch for danger before it arrived. "You still have not told me why you were running," he said eventually, keeping his voice even, careful not to press too hard. He had learned long ago that some truths could only be coaxed out gently, never forced. Elena's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly, her fingers curling around the edge of the bowl instead, as though seeking something solid to hold on to. My pack decided I was no longer needed there, she said finally, her voice carefully controlled, though he could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. There was an agreement made with another pack. I was to be given to them, as part of securing peace between our territories. Damien's expression did not change, but something inside him sharpened at her words. He understood immediately what she meant, understood the practice all too well, though he had always found it distasteful even among alphas who considered it a reasonable custom. Trading an Omega-like currency to smooth over disputes between packs was not unheard of, but it was a practice he had never permitted within his own lands, and one he privately regarded as a failure of leadership rather than a demonstration of it. And you decided you would rather face a storm alone than accept that arrangement, he said, not quite a question. Elena nodded, her gaze fixed on the bowl in front of her, rather than on him. I have spent my whole life being told I mattered less than everyone around me. I was tired of proving them right by simply accepting whatever they decided for me. The quiet steel in her voice, so at odds with her fragile physical state, caught Damien's attention in a way he had not anticipated. He had expected fear from her, perhaps desperation, but underneath both of those things ran a thread of quiet defiance that told him this woman, whoever she truly was, possessed more strength than her circumstances had ever allowed her to show. "What pack did you come from?" he asked. Elena hesitated again, and he could see the calculation behind her eyes, the careful weighing of how much to reveal to a stranger who held complete authority over whether she stayed or was sent back into the storm. "The Marsh Pack," she said finally, "to the east, along the ridgelands." Damien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He knew of the Marsh Pack, knew its leader by reputation, a wolf named Victor who ruled through fear rather than respect, who treated the wolves beneath him as tools rather than as members of a family bound together by loyalty. He had never had direct dealings with Victor, their territories bordering but rarely overlapping, but what little he had heard over the years painted a picture of a pack held together by intimidation rather than genuine strength. "And this other pack, the one you were meant to be given to, do you know its name?" "Ashwood," Elena said quietly. "I have never met their alpha. I do not know anything about them, only that Victor believed handing me over would secure peace between our territories, whatever conflict that peace was meant to resolve." Damien filed the information away carefully, his mind already working through the implications, though he kept his expression neutral for Elena's sake. He had no interest in involving himself in disputes between smaller packs unless they threatened the stability of his own territory. But something about this situation, about this woman sitting across from him with quiet dignity despite everything she had endured, made him reconsider his usual detachment. "You are safe here, for now," he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. He had not planned to make such an offer, had fully intended to simply provide shelter until the storm cleared, and then determine what to do with an unexpected trespasser, according to the strict protocols his position demanded. Yet something about her story, about the way she carried herself despite everything, made those protocols feel suddenly insufficient. Elena looked up at him then, surprise flickering across her features before she quickly masked it. "You do not have to do that," she said carefully. "I understand I have no right to ask anything of you. I trespassed on your land. Whatever happens next, I accept that it is your decision to make." "I am not offering out of obligation," Damien said, meeting her gaze steadily. "I am offering because sending you back out into that storm, or worse, returning you to a pack that would trade you away like property, is not something I am willing to do." The silence that followed felt heavier than any words could have been. Elena studied him, searching his face for some hidden motive, some catch to his offer that she had learned through hard experience to expect from those in positions of power. But she found nothing there except quiet resolve, an authority that did not require cruelty to assert itself. "Why would you help me?" she asked finally, the question genuine, stripped of the careful diplomacy she had used throughout their conversation. "You do not know me. I am nothing to you, an Omega who broke into your home uninvited." Damien considered the question longer than he expected to need. He was not entirely certain of the answer himself, only that something about her presence in his cabin had shifted something within him that he did not yet fully understand. Perhaps, he said slowly, because I have spent enough years watching wolves treat each other as currency rather than as family, and I am tired of pretending that is simply how things must be. Elena did not respond immediately, but something in her posture eased slightly, a fraction of the tension she had been carrying since waking, finally loosening. It was not full trust, not yet, but it was something, a small crack in the wall she had built around herself out of necessity. Outside, the storm continued to howl against the cabin walls, though its fury had noticeably lessened since the previous night. Damien rose to add another log to the fire, giving Elena a moment of privacy to process everything that had happened. As he watched the flames catch and grow, he found himself considering, with an unfamiliar sense of uncertainty, exactly what he intended to do next. He had rules, boundaries he had maintained carefully throughout his years as Alpha King, protocols designed to keep his territory stable and his authority unquestioned. Harboring a trespassing Omega from a neighboring pack, one who had fled an arranged exchange meant to secure peace between rival territories, was not a decision to be made lightly. It carried consequences, political and otherwise, that extended far beyond the walls of this small cabin. And yet, as he glanced back toward Elena, watching her slowly finish the last of her broth with the careful, measured movements of someone unaccustomed to comfort, he found that he could not bring himself to regret the choice he had already made, even before fully acknowledging he had made it. Whatever came next, whatever complications arose from allowing this stranger to remain within his territory, Damien understood, with quiet certainty, that he was no longer simply dealing with a trespasser to be dismissed. Something about Elena had already begun to matter to him, in ways he did not yet have words for, and that realization alone told him that the storm outside was far from the only thing that had changed since she stumbled into his world. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither Elena nor Damien had expected. The storm finally broke on the second morning, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine white, sunlight glinting off snow that stretched endlessly between the tall pines surrounding the cabin. Elena still could not leave safely, not with her strength barely returned, and no clear place to go that would not lead her straight back into danger. So Damien made the decision to let her remain a little longer, though he told himself repeatedly that this arrangement was temporary. Elena, for her part, found herself both grateful and deeply confused by the situation she had landed in. Every instinct she had developed throughout years of mistreatment told her to remain cautious, to wait for the moment when kindness would reveal itself as a mask for something crueler. Yet each day that passed without incident chipped away slightly at the walls she had built so carefully around herself. She noticed things about Damien that did not match the reputation she vaguely remembered hearing about the Alpha King, whispered stories among wolves from lesser packs, who spoke of his authority with a mixture of respect and fear. He was undeniably powerful, that much was obvious in the way he carried himself, in the quiet command that seemed to radiate from him without effort. But he was also patient, in ways she had not expected, careful with his words, attentive to details she doubted most alphas would have bothered to notice. On the third day, she woke to find he had left before dawn, presumably to attend to duties within his territory that could not be neglected simply because an unexpected guest occupied his cabin. She spent the morning exploring the small space more thoroughly than she had allowed herself to before, running her fingers along the spines of books stacked neatly on a shelf, most of them worn from repeated use rather than kept for display. It struck her as strange that someone with such immense power would surround himself with so little in the way of luxury. When Damien returned that evening, brushing snow from his shoulders as he stepped through the door, Elena found herself watching him with an attention she had not intended to give. He moved through the cabin with the ease of someone who valued function over show, setting aside a small satchel he had carried with supplies she recognized as basic necessities rather than indulgences. "You seem to be regaining your strength," he observed, glancing toward her as he settled into the chair across from the fire. "I feel much better," Elena admitted, surprised at how true the words were. The color had returned to her cheeks, the persistent ache in her limbs had faded, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had slept without waking from nightmares of being dragged back to a life she despised. "I should think about where I go from here soon. I cannot stay indefinitely." Something flickered across Damien's expression at her words, quick enough that she almost missed it. "Where would you go?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, though something beneath it suggested the question meant more to him than he let on. Elena considered the question honestly, turning it over in her mind for the first time since her escape. She had fled without any real plan, beyond putting distance between herself and her former pack. She had no allies elsewhere, no family who might take her in, no resources to build a new life from nothing. The reality of her situation, one she had been avoiding confronting directly, settled over her with sudden weight. "I do not know," she admitted quietly. "I did not think beyond escaping. I suppose I hoped that once I was far enough away, I would figure out the rest." Damien studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his dark eyes, though whatever conclusions he was drawing remained hidden from her. "You could remain here longer," he said finally, the offer coming out more carefully than his previous statements, as though he had considered the words before speaking them. "Not indefinitely without discussion, but long enough to properly plan your next steps, rather than rushing into another situation you are not prepared for." Elena's breath caught slightly at the offer, surprise and something warmer she did not immediately recognize stirring within her chest. "You would allow that? After everything? After I broke into your home without permission?" "You did not break in with any intention of causing harm," Damien said. "You were desperate and cold, seeking shelter from a storm that could have killed you." "That is a very different thing from trespassing with malicious intent." Elena looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond to kindness so freely given, especially from someone whose position gave him every right to demand something in return. She had learned through hard experience that generosity rarely came without strings attached, yet she could sense no hidden agenda in his offer, only a genuine willingness to help someone he had no obligation to assist at all. "Thank you," she said finally, the words feeling insufficient for the magnitude of what he was offering her. Safety and time she had not expected to receive from anyone, least of all from the most powerful wolf in the region. Over the following days, a tentative routine began to form between them. Damien would leave each morning to attend to the demands of ruling his territory, matters Elena understood only in vague terms, since he rarely discussed the details of pack governance with her. She spent her days regaining her strength, helping where she could around the small cabin despite his insistence that she rest rather than work, and slowly, carefully, allowing herself to relax in a way she had not experienced in years. In the evenings, when Damien returned, they began to talk more freely, conversations stretching longer each night, as the initial wariness between them gradually softened. Elena found herself sharing fragments of her past she had never spoken aloud to anyone, small moments of cruelty she had endured within her former pack, the constant weight of being told she mattered less than others, simply because of the rank she had been born into. Damien listened without judgment, his expression darkening at certain details, in a way that told her the anger she sensed in him was not directed at her, but at those who had treated her so poorly. In turn, he shared pieces of his own life, the immense pressure of leading a territory, as vast as his, the isolation that came with holding power few others could understand or relate to. "It is strange," Elena said one evening, watching the firelight dance across the walls of the cabin, "how much easier it is to speak honestly with someone who has no history with me, no expectations already formed about who I am supposed to be." Damien's gaze softened slightly at her words. "Perhaps that is because those expectations were never fair to begin with," he said. "You deserved better than what you were given, long before you ever found your way here." Something about the simple sincerity of his words settled deep within her, warming parts of herself she had thought long since hardened beyond feeling. She had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of consideration, of basic decency, that hearing it stated so plainly by someone whose opinion carried genuine weight left her momentarily speechless. As the fire burned low that night, Elena realized with quiet unease that whatever this arrangement had become, it was no longer simply about survival or temporary shelter. Something had shifted between them, subtle but undeniable, and she was no longer certain she wanted to leave, even once she had the strength and opportunity to do so. Word of an unfamiliar scent lingering near the Alpha King's private cabin eventually reached members of Damien's inner circle, as such things inevitably did within a pack accustomed to noticing every shift in their leader's routine. It was Julian, Damien's most trusted second and closest friend since childhood, who finally approached him directly about the matter, catching him alone near the training grounds on the outskirts of the main settlement. "You have been spending considerably more time at the cabin than usual," Julian observed, falling into step beside Damien as they walked. and there are whispers among the pack about a scent trail that does not belong to anyone here. Damien did not slow his pace, though he considered his response carefully before speaking. He trusted Julian more than almost anyone within his territory, but even trusted allies could complicate matters if word spread too quickly before he fully understood the situation himself. "There is someone staying there temporarily," Damien said finally, deciding that outright denial would only breed more suspicion than honesty. "An Omega, from the Marsh Pack, who fled an arrangement that would have traded her to the Ashwood territory." Julian's eyebrows rose slightly at the explanation, though he kept his tone measured. "That is no small matter, Damien. Sheltering someone who fled an arrangement between two other packs could easily be seen as interference in territory disputes that do not concern us." "She was fleeing for her safety," Damien said, an edge entering his voice that surprised even him. "I was not about to send a desperate, frightened wolf back out into a storm, simply because offering shelter might complicate diplomatic relations with packs I have no particular loyalty toward regardless." Julian studied his friend carefully, noting something in Damien's tone he had rarely heard before, a protectiveness that seemed to extend well beyond simple hospitality. "How long do you intend for her to remain?" "I have not decided," Damien admitted. "For now, she needs time to recover and determine her next steps. That is all this is." Julian did not look entirely convinced, but he respected his alpha enough not to press further in that moment. "Just be aware," he said carefully, "that if this arrangement becomes known more widely, particularly to Victor Marsh or the Ashwood leadership, there may be consequences you will need to manage. An Omega fleeing an arranged exchange is one thing. An Omega being sheltered by the Alpha King himself is something else entirely." Damien understood the warning for what it was, a reminder of the political complexities that came with his position, complexities he had navigated skillfully for years, without allowing personal matters to interfere. Yet as he considered Julian's words, he found himself unwilling to reconsider the choice he had already made regarding Elena's continued presence in his territory. That evening, as he made his way back toward the cabin through the fading light of dusk, Damien found himself reflecting on exactly how quickly his careful, controlled world had begun shifting since Elena's unexpected arrival. He had built his reputation on decisiveness, on maintaining clear boundaries between duty and personal inclination. Yet here he was, willing to risk political complications for a woman he had known only a matter of days. When he entered the cabin, Elena looked up from where she sat near the fire, a book open in her lap that she had clearly been reading, despite the fading light. Something in her expression, a mixture of curiosity and quiet contentment, struck him with unexpected force. "You seem troubled," she observed, closing the book carefully and setting it aside as he settled into the chair across from her. "Word has reached my pack about your presence here," Damien admitted, deciding honesty served them both better than allowing her to remain unaware of the complications surrounding her continued stay. "It may become known more widely, particularly to your former pack, that you are here." Elena's expression tightened with unmistakable fear at his words. "If Victor learns I am here, under your protection, he may see it as an insult, a challenge to his authority. He could use it as justification for conflict between our territories." "That is a possibility," Damien acknowledged, refusing to soften the truth simply to ease her worry. "But it does not change my intention to continue protecting you. Whatever consequences arise from that choice, I will manage them." Elena studied him carefully, searching his expression for any hint of hesitation or regret, but found none. The certainty in his voice, the steady resolve behind his words, settled something anxious within her chest that had been building since he first mentioned the possibility of her presence becoming known. "Why would you take that risk for someone you barely know?" she asked, the question one she had asked in various forms since arriving, never quite satisfied with the answers she had received so far. Damien considered his response carefully, aware that whatever he said next would shape the trajectory of whatever was developing between them, whether he acknowledged it openly or not. "Because turning you away, or allowing fear of political consequence to outweigh what is simply the right choice, is not the kind of leader I intend to be," he said finally. "And because, if I am being entirely honest, I find that I care what happens to you, far more than logic alone would suggest I should, given how briefly we have known each other." The admission hung between them, quiet but unmistakable, an acknowledgement neither of them had spoken aloud before despite the growing warmth that had developed over their evenings together. Elena felt her heart quicken at his words, a mixture of hope and fear tangling together within her. Hope for something she had never dared imagine for herself, fear that allowing herself to want it would only lead to greater heartbreak if circumstances forced them apart. "I do not want to be the reason your territory faces conflict," she said quietly, though the protest carried less conviction than she intended. "You are not the reason for anything," Damien said firmly. "Any conflict that arises would be the result of a pack leader who believes he has the right to treat another person as currency to be traded away. That is not a burden you should carry." Elena did not respond immediately, but something in her posture eased, the tension she had been holding since his mention of the growing complications finally loosening slightly. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever consequences might arise from Victor Marsh or the Ashwood pack discovering her whereabouts, she found herself trusting, more fully than she had trusted anyone in longer than she could remember, that Damien would face those challenges without wavering. As the fire crackled softly between them, and the last light of evening faded into full darkness outside, neither of them spoke further about the risks ahead. Instead, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, each aware that whatever came next, they would face it together, though neither yet understood exactly how deep that shared commitment had already become. Winter deepened around the cabin over the following week, blanketing the surrounding forest in ever thicker layers of snow, yet within its walls, something else was steadily growing warmer. Elena found herself waiting for Damien's return each evening, with an eagerness she could not fully explain away, as simple gratitude for his protection. There was something else now, something that stirred low in her chest whenever he walked through the door, something that made her pulse quicken in ways she had never experienced before. She tried to rationalize it at first, telling herself that any kindness would feel overwhelming after years of neglect and cruelty, that her reaction to Damien's presence was simply relief, mistaken for something deeper. But as the days passed, and the feeling only intensified rather than fading, she began to suspect there was more to it than gratitude alone. Damien, for his part, found himself equally unsettled by the shift occurring within him. He had led his territory for years without allowing personal attachments to interfere with his responsibilities, had maintained careful distance from anyone who might complicate the clarity he needed to rule effectively. Yet Elena had somehow slipped past every defense he had built, not through any deliberate effort on her part, but simply through the quiet strength and vulnerability she carried in equal measure. He noticed the way her presence had changed the cabin itself, how the space that had once felt merely functional now felt genuinely warm, filled with the small sounds of her humming softly while she tended the fire, or the quiet rustle of pages as she read late into the evening. He found himself looking forward to returning each night, in a way he had never anticipated, returning to an empty cabin before her arrival. One evening, as a light snow fell outside the windows, casting a soft hush over the forest, Elena sat mending a small tear in one of the blankets Damien had given her, her fingers moving with careful precision despite the simplicity of the task. Damien watched her from across the room, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest as he observed the quiet concentration on her face. "You do not have to do that," he said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I can easily replace the blanket." Elena glanced up, a small smile touching her lips, one of the first genuine smiles he had seen from her since her arrival. "I know," she said, "but I want to. It feels good to be useful, to contribute something, rather than simply receiving without giving anything in return." "You give more than you realize," Damien said, before he could fully consider the weight of his words. Elena's hands stilled on the blanket, her gaze meeting his with an intensity that made the air between them feel suddenly charged. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Damien rose from his chair, crossing the small distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. She did not. Instead, she watched him approach with an expression that mirrored the uncertain hope he felt within himself, a fragile thing neither of them had quite dared to name aloud. "I mean," he said, settling onto the floor beside her, closer than he had allowed himself to be since the night he first found her sleeping by his fire, that this cabin has felt more like a home in the past 2 weeks than it has in years, and that has everything to do with you. Elena's breath caught, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "Damien," she said, his name feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue in this new context, stripped of formality, spoken simply because she wanted to say it. "I know this is complicated," he continued, his voice lower now, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. "I know there are questions about your safety, about what happens next, about consequences neither of us can fully predict. But I cannot continue pretending that what I feel toward you is simply concern for someone under my protection. It has become something far more than that." Elena set aside the blanket entirely now, turning to face him fully, her eyes searching his for any hesitation, any doubt that might suggest he was not entirely certain of his own words. She found none, only steady, quiet honesty that matched the feelings she had been trying to deny within herself for days. "I feel it too," she admitted, the words releasing something tight and anxious within her chest. "I have tried to tell myself it is simply gratitude, that anyone would feel this way toward someone who saved them from certain death in that storm. But it is more than that, and I think I have known it for longer than I have wanted to admit." The space between them felt impossibly small now. Charged with anticipation, neither of them rushed to resolve. Damien reached out slowly, giving her every chance to step back, and brushed a strand of hair away from her face, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the commanding presence she had first encountered days earlier. "I will not pretend this does not complicate things significantly," he said softly. "There will be challenges ahead, from your former pack, from the broader politics of territory and alliance. But I find that none of those complications outweigh what I feel when I am near you." Elena leaned into his touch, something settling within her that felt remarkably like coming home, after a lifetime of searching for a place she belonged. "I have spent my whole life being told I was worth less than others," she whispered. "Being here with you, feeling what I feel, it is the first time I have believed otherwise." Neither of them spoke for a long moment, simply existing together in the quiet warmth of the cabin, the fire crackling softly beside them, snow continuing to fall silently outside the windows. Whatever challenges awaited them beyond these walls, whatever forces might eventually rise to test the bond forming between them, neither Elena nor Damien doubted, in this fragile, honest moment, that what they had found together was worth protecting, whatever the cost. As Damien finally leaned forward to press a gentle kiss against her forehead, a promise more than a demand, Elena closed her eyes and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel safe, cherished, and entirely, unquestionably wanted. The peace they had found together did not last uninterrupted for long. Nearly 3 weeks after Elena's arrival, a messenger from the Marsh Pack appeared at the border of Damien's territory, demanding an audience with the Alpha King regarding what Victor Marsh described as a matter of urgent importance. Damien received the news from Julian with a grim sense of inevitability, understanding immediately that word of Elena's presence had finally reached her former pack. "They know," Damien said simply, watching Julian's expression confirm what he already suspected. The messenger would not specify details, only that Victor demands the immediate return of an Omega who fled his territory under his protection. Julian replied carefully. "He has framed her disappearance as theft, claiming she was pack property that has been unlawfully harbored on your land." Anger flared through Damien at the description, sharp and immediate. The idea that anyone could speak of Elena, of any living wolf, as property to be reclaimed, rather than a person with agency over her own life, struck him as fundamentally wrong, a perspective he had never shared, even before Elena's arrival, had made the issue personal. "Arrange a meeting," Damien said, his voice hardening with resolve. "I will hear what Victor Marsh has to say directly, and he will hear my response just as directly." That evening, when Damien returned to the cabin and relayed the news to Elena, he watched fear ripple across her features, old patterns of anxiety resurfacing, despite the weeks of growing safety she had experienced within his territory. "He will not simply accept your refusal," she said quietly, wrapping her arms around herself as though physically bracing against the threat. "Victor does not tolerate being denied what he believes belongs to him. He may see this as justification for greater conflict, not just with you, but potentially with other packs he could rally against your territory." "Let him try," Damien said, though he understood her fear was not unfounded. Political conflicts between territories rarely remained contained, and involving multiple packs in a dispute over Elena's safety carried risks that extended far beyond the two of them personally. Yet he found that understanding those risks did nothing to shake his resolve to protect her. "I do not want to be the cause of a larger conflict," Elena said, echoing concerns she had voiced before, though now with sharper urgency given the immediate threat. "Perhaps I should simply leave, disappear somewhere far from both territories, somewhere Victor cannot easily find me, and use as justification for confronting you directly." "No," Damien said firmly, the single word carrying enough weight that Elena fell silent immediately. "I will not allow fear of political consequence to dictate whether you remain safe. You are not responsible for Victor's choices, only he is, and I will not send you away simply to avoid confrontation with a man who believes he has the right to treat you as property." Elena studied him carefully, searching for any hesitation in his resolve, but found only steady determination. Something within her, some deeply ingrained instinct built from years of being told her needs mattered less than the convenience of others, wanted to argue further, to insist on removing herself from the equation entirely, rather than risk causing harm to Damien's territory or his people. But another part of her, one that had been slowly growing stronger throughout her weeks in his care, recognized the sincerity behind his commitment, and something within her finally allowed herself to trust it fully. "Then I will stand beside you when Victor arrives," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I will not hide from him as though I have done something shameful. I left because his treatment of me was wrong, and I will say so directly if given the opportunity." Damien's expression softened at her declaration, pride mixing with something deeper, as he watched the quiet strength that had always existed within her rise more fully to the surface. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Facing him directly will not be easy, particularly given everything you endured within his pack." "I am certain," Elena said, and though her voice trembled slightly with the admission, her resolve remained clear. "I have spent too long being spoken about as though I have no voice of my own. If Victor comes to reclaim what he believes belongs to him, he will hear directly from me exactly why that belief is wrong." The meeting was arranged for 3 days later, at the border between Damien's territory and neutral ground, shared occasionally for diplomatic discussions between packs. As the day approached, tension built steadily within the cabin, both Elena and Damien aware of everything that hung in the balance, not simply Elena's safety, but the broader stability of the delicate political relationships between neighboring territories. On the morning of the meeting, Elena dressed carefully in clothing Damien had provided, simple but dignified, nothing like the worn garments she had fled her former pack wearing weeks earlier. She studied her reflection in the small mirror within the cabin, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her, someone who stood a little taller, whose eyes held a steadiness that had not existed before her time within Damien's protection. "You look ready," Damien observed from the doorway, watching her with quiet admiration. "I do not feel entirely ready," Elena admitted, turning to face him, "but I am no longer willing to let fear control my choices, regardless of how frightening this confrontation may be." Damien crossed the room and took her hands gently in his own, meeting her eyes with steady reassurance. "Whatever happens today, you will not face it alone. I will be beside you every step, and my pack stands ready to defend this territory, and everyone within it, including you." Elena nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence, from the certainty in his voice that left no room for doubt regarding his commitment to her safety. Together, they left the cabin and made their way toward the meeting point, the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment, settling heavily, but not crushingly upon them both. As they approached the neutral ground where Victor Marsh and his entourage already waited, Elena felt her pulse quicken, old fears rising alongside newfound resolve. Whatever confrontation awaited her, whatever accusations or demands Victor intended to make, she understood with sudden clarity that she was no longer the powerless Omega who had fled through a storm weeks earlier. She had found her voice, found her strength, found someone who valued her not despite her rank within pack hierarchy, but entirely separate from such arbitrary distinctions altogether. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it, not as property to be reclaimed, but as a person determined to claim her own future, regardless of who stood in opposition to that choice. Victor Marsh stood waiting at the border, with a small group of his most senior pack members, his posture radiating the same arrogant authority Elena remembered from years spent beneath his rule. He was an imposing figure, broad and weathered, with cold eyes that had never once looked upon her with anything resembling warmth or respect. Beside him stood Corinne, his mate, and the pack's Luna, whose sharp gaze immediately fixed on Elena with undisguised contempt. "So the rumors were true," Victor said as Damien and Elena approached, his voice carrying easily across the snow-covered clearing. "You have been harboring my Omega within your territory, Alpha King. I must say, I expected better judgment from someone of your reputation." "She is not your Omega," Damien replied evenly, his tone carrying quiet authority that immediately shifted the dynamic of the confrontation. "She is a person who fled mistreatment within your pack, and she has chosen to remain under my protection since arriving here." Victor's expression darkened at the direct challenge, though he maintained enough composure to keep his voice level. "She belongs to the Marsh Pack. She was born within our territory, raised under our protection, and she owes obligations to that pack regardless of her personal feelings on the matter. Her disappearance disrupted an important arrangement with the Ashwood territory, one that took considerable effort to establish." "An arrangement made without her consent," Elena said, stepping forward before Damien could respond, her voice steadier than she expected, given the fear still coiling within her at facing Victor directly again. "You decided my fate as though I were a possession to be traded, without ever considering that I might have thoughts or preferences of my own regarding my future." Victor's gaze snapped toward her, surprise flickering briefly across his features before hardening back into contempt. "You forget your place," he said sharply. "Omegas do not question the decisions made by pack leadership. That has always been the way of things, and your recent defiance does not change that fundamental truth." "Perhaps it should change," Damien interjected, his voice carrying enough authority that even Victor's confident posture wavered slightly. "The way of things, as you describe it, has caused Elena significant harm throughout her life within your pack. That is not a tradition worth preserving, and I will not stand by while you attempt to reclaim someone who has found genuine safety and respect for the first time in her life." Corinne stepped forward then, her expression sharp with barely concealed anger. "This is not your concern, Alpha King. Whatever sympathy you feel toward this Omega does not grant you the right to interfere in matters belonging to another pack entirely." "It became my concern the moment she sought shelter within my territory," Damien said firmly, "and it remains my concern given the growing bond between us, one I have no intention of abandoning simply because it complicates your plans." The revelation of a deeper connection between Damien and Elena visibly shifted something in Victor's expression, calculation, replacing simple anger, as he processed the implications of what Damien had just admitted. "You intend to claim her," he said slowly, understanding dawning across his features. "You would risk conflict between our territories over an Omega you have known mere weeks." "I would risk far more than that, for someone I have come to care for deeply," Damien replied without hesitation. "And I would remind you, Victor, that any conflict arising from this matter would be conflict you chose to initiate, not myself. I have no interest in expanding tension between our territories unnecessarily, but I will not return Elena to a pack that treated her as disposable property, rather than a valued member of your community." Victor's jaw tightened, calculation shifting behind his eyes as he weighed the political realities of the situation before him. Damien's territory vastly outmatched his own in both size and strength, and any direct conflict between them would almost certainly end poorly for the Marsh Pack regardless of whatever justification Victor believed he possessed. "This will not simply be forgotten," Victor said finally, though the threat carried less weight than his earlier bravado. "The Ashwood Pack will not be pleased to learn their arranged exchange has fallen through due to interference from your territory. That is a matter between you and the Ashwood Pack to resolve," Damien said calmly. "It has nothing to do with Elena, who bears no responsibility for agreements made entirely without her consent or input." Elena watched the exchange with a strange sense of detachment, as though observing the confrontation from a distance rather than standing at its very center. For years, she had feared exactly this moment, imagining countless scenarios where Victor's authority would ultimately prove inescapable, where she would be dragged back into a life of servitude regardless of how far she managed to flee. Yet standing here now, beside someone whose strength and conviction matched her own newfound resolve, she felt none of the crushing helplessness she had always associated with confronting her former alpha. "I am not returning," she said, her voice cutting clearly through the tension surrounding them. "Whatever obligations you believe I owe your pack, I have more than fulfilled them through years of service, given without complaint, without recognition, without basic decency in return. I choose my own path now, and that path does not include returning to a life where my worth is measured only by how useful I am to others. Victor stared at her for a long moment, something almost like grudging respect flickering briefly across his hardened features before disappearing beneath renewed anger. "You will regret this defiance," he said, though the threat felt hollow, given the reality of the political situation surrounding them. "I doubt that very much," Elena replied steadily, recognizing the futility of continuing the confrontation, particularly given the clear military and political disadvantage his pack faced against Damien's territory. Victor finally stepped back, his expression tight with barely contained frustration. "This is not resolved," he said, addressing Damien directly, "but I have no interest in initiating conflict I cannot win. Keep your Omega, Alpha King, if you believe her worth the complications she brings." "She is worth far more than complications," Damien replied evenly. "She is worth everything." Without further words, Victor turned and departed with his entourage, Corinne casting one final scathing glance toward Elena, before following her mate back across the border into their own territory. As the group disappeared into the tree line, tension slowly began releasing from Elena's shoulders, relief flooding through her so intensely that she nearly stumbled. Damien caught her gently, steadying her against him, as the adrenaline of the confrontation finally began fading. "You were incredible," he said softly, pride evident in every word. "I have never seen anyone stand up to Victor Marsh with such conviction." "I could not have done it without you beside me," Elena admitted, leaning into his support gratefully. "Knowing you stood with me, that I was not facing him alone this time, gave me strength I did not know I still possessed." As they made their way back toward the cabin together, the weight of the confrontation slowly lifting from their shoulders, both Elena and Damien understood that while this particular threat had been resolved, the larger challenges of building a life together, of navigating the complexities their bond would inevitably bring, still lay ahead. But for the first time since her desperate flight through the storm weeks earlier, Elena felt genuine hope for whatever future awaited her, hope rooted not in mere survival, but in the possibility of true belonging. In the weeks following the confrontation with Victor Marsh, life within Damien's territory began settling into a new and steadier rhythm, though the path ahead still required careful navigation. News of the encounter had spread quickly among Damien's pack, and while most members received the story with quiet approval of their alpha's decisive protection of someone they had come to view with growing respect, others within the broader council of advisors remained more cautious about the political implications of Damien's evolving relationship with an Omega from a rival territory. Damien called a formal gathering of his council to address these concerns directly, understanding that whatever future he intended to build with Elena required the full support and understanding of those who governed alongside him. Elena stood beside him as he addressed the assembled leaders, her earlier fear of such formal settings tempered now by the steady confidence she had gained through weeks of proving to herself, and to those around her, that she deserved a place among them. "I understand there are concerns regarding the wisdom of my choice to protect Elena, and now to publicly acknowledge the deepening bond between us," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered hall. "Some among you worry this decision complicates our diplomatic standing with neighboring territories. I do not dismiss those concerns lightly." Julian, standing near the front of the assembly, nodded encouragingly, having already voiced his support for Damien's decision in private discussions leading up to this moment. Other council members exchanged glances, some skeptical, others thoughtful, weighing the implications of what their Alpha King was proposing. "But I ask you to consider this," Damien continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled leaders with quiet conviction. "What example do we set for our own pack, for the generations who will inherit the values we choose to uphold today, if we allow fear of political complication to outweigh basic decency toward those who have been wronged?" Elena did not simply stumble into our territory by chance. She fled genuine mistreatment, sought safety, and found it here. Turning her away, or treating her bond with me as a liability, rather than a strength, would betray the very principles I have tried to build this territory upon. A murmur rippled through the assembled council as his words settled over them. One of the older advisors, a wolf named Owen who had served Damien's father before him, rose slowly to speak. Alpha King, Owen said respectfully. Your father built this territory on principles of strength tempered by fairness, on leadership that protects rather than exploits those beneath it. If this Omega represents those same values, if her presence here strengthens rather than weakens what we have built, then I see no reason to oppose your decision. Elena felt a wave of gratitude wash over her at Owen's words, unexpected support from someone whose opinion clearly carried significant weight among the council. She glanced toward Damien, finding him watching her with quiet pride, and drew strength from his steady presence beside her. I have spent these past weeks getting to know Elena, not simply as someone under my protection, but as a person of remarkable strength and integrity, Damien continued, addressing the remaining skeptics directly. She stood before Victor Marsh with more courage than many wolves, twice her physical strength could have mustered. She has earned her place here through her own character, not through any political convenience. Gradually, the tension within the hall began easing as more council members voiced their support, swayed by the combination of Damien's evident conviction and Elena's own quiet dignity as she stood before them, refusing to shrink beneath their scrutiny, despite the vulnerability of the situation. By the time the formal gathering concluded, it had become clear that whatever hesitation existed among Damien's council had largely dissolved into acceptance, if not outright enthusiasm, regarding the bond forming between their Alpha and the Omega who had found her way into his territory through such extraordinary circumstances. Later that evening, as they walked together back toward the cabin beneath a sky brilliant with stars, Elena finally allowed herself to fully process everything that had transpired throughout the day. I did not expect them to accept this so readily, she admitted, glancing toward Damien as they walked side by side through the snow. They trust my judgment, Damien said simply. And more importantly, they saw for themselves the strength and integrity you carry. That is not something easily dismissed, regardless of the circumstances surrounding your arrival here. Elena smiled softly, warmth spreading through her chest at his words. It still feels strange, she said, to be valued so openly, after spending so many years believing myself worth so little. Damien stopped walking, turning to face her fully beneath the star-filled sky, his expression serious, despite the tenderness evident in his eyes. You were always worth far more than you were told, he said quietly. I only wish you had discovered that truth sooner, without having to endure everything you did before finding your way here. Perhaps, Elena said softly, reaching up to gently touch his face. Everything I endured was simply the path that led me to exactly where I was always meant to be. Damien leaned into her touch, closing his eyes briefly, before opening them again to meet her gaze with quiet intensity. Elena, he said, his voice carrying a weight that immediately captured her full attention. I know it has only been a matter of weeks since you arrived here, but I find myself more certain of what I want than I have been about almost anything else in my life. I want you to remain here not simply as someone under my protection, but as my mate, as the future Luna of this territory, standing beside me as an equal partner in everything I do. Elena's breath caught, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes as the weight of his words settled fully within her. Are you certain? She whispered, old fears of unworthiness still whispering faintly, despite everything she had come to believe about her own value over these past weeks. I have never been more certain of anything, Damien said firmly. You are not simply someone I rescued from a storm, Elena. You are someone who has shown me, through your own strength and resilience, exactly what true partnership and leadership should look like. I want to build a future with you, one where you never again have to wonder whether you are valued or wanted. Elena felt the last remnants of doubt finally dissolve within her, replaced by a certainty as steady and warm as the bond that had grown between them throughout these transformative weeks. Yes, she said, the single word carrying the full weight of everything she had come to feel. Yes, I want that future with you, more than I have ever wanted anything. As Damien gathered her into his arms beneath the star-filled winter sky, Elena felt something settle within her that she had never fully experienced before. Not merely safety, but genuine belonging. The sense of finally having found not just a place to survive, but a home where she was truly, completely valued for exactly who she was. Spring arrived gradually across Damien's territory, melting the deep snow that had blanketed the forest since the night Elena first stumbled through the storm into his private cabin. The transformation of the landscape mirrored, in many ways, the transformation Elena herself had undergone throughout those months. From a frightened, exhausted Omega fleeing certain hardship, to a woman standing confidently beside the Alpha King as his chosen mate and future Luna. The pack had prepared a celebration to mark their formal union, one that drew wolves from across Damien's territory, all eager to witness the joining of their Alpha King with the woman whose quiet strength had already earned genuine respect among those who had come to know her over the preceding months. Elena stood at the edge of the gathering grounds, dressed in flowing fabric the color of winter's last frost, watching the preparations with a sense of wonder she still had not fully grown accustomed to. "You look nervous," Nora, one of the pack members who had become a close friend over the recent months, observed with a gentle smile, as she helped adjust the delicate arrangement of flowers woven through Elena's hair. "I suppose I am," Elena admitted, glancing toward her reflection in the small mirror Nora held steady. "Everything has changed so completely since I arrived here. Sometimes it still feels difficult to believe this is truly my life now." "You have earned every bit of it," Nora said firmly. "I have watched you these past months, watched how you carry yourself, how you speak up in council meetings, how you have taken time to know each member of this pack individually, rather than simply expecting deference because of your position beside Damien. You belong here, Elena, completely and without question." Elena felt tears threaten at the sincerity in Nora's words, gratitude swelling within her for the community that had welcomed her so fully, despite the unusual circumstances of her arrival. She thought back to the frightened, desperate woman who had broken into a cabin window months earlier, seeking nothing more than temporary shelter from a killing storm, and marveled at how far that journey had carried her. As the ceremony began, Elena made her way toward the center of the gathering grounds, where Damien waited for her beneath an archway decorated with early spring blooms, his expression radiating a warmth and certainty that steadied her nerves with every step she took toward him. The assembled pack fell silent as she approached, hundreds of eyes watching, but for the first time in her life, Elena found she did not shrink beneath their attention. Instead, she stood tall, meeting their gazes with quiet confidence, born from months of proving, both to herself and to those around her, exactly what she was capable of. When she finally reached Damien, he took her hands gently in his own, his eyes never leaving hers, as the pack's eldest member, tasked with overseeing the ceremonial bonding, began the traditional words that would formally join them as mates and leaders of the territory together. "Elena," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering, "you arrived in my life during the depths of winter, seeking nothing more than safety from a storm that threatened to take everything from you. What I found instead was someone whose strength, whose resilience, whose capacity for genuine kindness despite everything life had denied her, changed the entire course of my own existence. I promise to stand beside you always, to value your voice as equal to my own in every decision that shapes our future together, and to ensure you never again doubt your own worth." Tears slipped freely down Elena's cheeks now as she listened to his words, overwhelmed by the depth of commitment he offered so openly before their entire community. When it came time for her own vow, she took a steadying breath, drawing on the strength she had cultivated throughout her journey. "Damien," she said, her voice carrying with surprising steadiness, despite the emotion coursing through her. "I came to your territory as someone who believed herself worth very little, shaped by years of being told my only value lay in what I could offer others without complaint or expectation of anything in return. You showed me a different truth, not through grand gestures, but through simple, consistent respect and genuine care. I promise to stand beside you as an equal partner, to bring my own strength to this territory and this pack, and to honor the trust you have placed in me by never taking for granted the home and family I have found here." As their vows concluded and the traditional bonding ritual sealed their union before the assembled pack, cheers erupted across the gathering grounds, wolves howling their approval toward the clearing sky above. Elena felt Damien's arms wrapped securely around her as the celebration began in earnest, laughter and music filling the spring evening air. Later, as the festivities continued around them, Elena found a quiet moment alone, with Damien near the edge of the gathering, both of them watching the joyful chaos of their pack's celebration from a slight distance. "It is remarkable," she said softly, leaning into his side, "how completely my life has changed since that night I broke into your cabin, seeking nothing more than shelter. It is remarkable, Damien agreed, pressing a gentle kiss against her temple. How completely you changed my life as well, simply by finding your way to exactly where you needed to be. Elena thought back to the frozen cabin, where their story had begun, the small, simple retreat that had once represented nothing more than solitude and privacy for a leader burdened by constant responsibility. Now, that same cabin stood as the place where everything had started, where a frightened Omega had found not just shelter from a storm, but the beginning of a life she had never dared imagine possible for herself. As the stars began emerging across the clearing sky above their celebrating pack, Elena felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, the culmination of a journey that had begun in desperation and fear, but had led her, through courage and unexpected kindness, to exactly the home and love she had always deserved, but never believed she would find. Whatever challenges the future held, she knew now, with unshakable certainty, that she would face them not as a discarded Omega with no voice of her own, but as the cherished Luna of a territory that had come to value her completely, standing beside a mate who had shown her, in the truest sense, exactly what it meant to finally belong.